Welcome to the Gateway Talks. This time, Buddha is a privy hole. Followers of the way, do not take the Buddha for the supreme aim. I myself see him as a privy hole, and the bodhisattvas and arhats as beings who bind men with kang and chains. This is why Manjushri grasped the sword to kill Gautama, and Angulimala took the knife to assassinate Shaka. Followers of the way, Buddha is not to be attained. The three vehicles and the five natures, as well as the complete and sudden teachings, are only traces. All are but expedient means, temporary remedies for curing diseases. There is no real Dharma. It is all but surface manifestations, like printed letters on a signboard to indicate the way. This is my teaching. So this is an extract of a sermon from the Zen teachings of Rinzai, translated by Irmgard Schlegel. And of course, Master Rinzai is one of the great founders of one of the still in existence Zen schools, the Rinzai Zen school. He lived and died in the 9th century AD in China. Lin Chi is his Chinese name. Rinzai is the name that he's commonly used. That's commonly used for him in Japan. And even though he had only a very brief teaching career, around about 10 years, the wheel of Dharma that he set in motion still goes to this day. And he has a very direct way of speaking. And perhaps in many ways this sermon is a classic example of that sort of attitude, the rather iconoclastic attitude that is often so favoured by Westerners, or certainly was anyway in the sort of 50s and 60s in America, the sort of beat poet thing, when iconoclasm was sort of all the rage. But really, to understand how this worked in its own setting in China in the 9th century, medieval China, we have to forget our own points of view, our own perspective, and see things really as the Chinese saw it in their own particular time. And of course, we must remember that Master Rinzai in the sermon would have been talking to his monks as well. These monks probably had been living at the monastery ever since they were boys, really. Often, rather like in Christianity, the boys would be given to the monastery because the families were too big and couldn't afford to feed them. And at least in the monasteries, they'd get more or less 3 square meals a day, medicine and accommodation and so forth, and a role in life as well. They might get a temple that would give them basically a living when they actually left. So we must remember that, of course, the monks who would have been listening to this sermon would have been truly devoted to the Buddha. Everything that they knew would be Buddha and Buddhism, the teachings, the precepts, and so forth. And we have to remember that when Master Rinzai is speaking to them, that is the effect. That is the context, and the effect on them, obviously, is going to be something of a shock. But anyway, we will get into that. Certainly, if you're familiar with Zen literature, I'm thinking now just of the Mumon-kan. The collection is one of the Koan collections. You get the Koan, and then Master Mumon, who compiled the Mumon-kan, would write a sort of commentary, a short commentary, and then pen a verse. And if you read them, he uses this method of disparagement frequently about the Buddha and about the great Zen Masters that came before him. And if you read it, on the surface, of course, you wonder what on earth is going on. Why would a Buddhist monk or a Buddhist priest or a Zen Buddhist master be disparaging the Buddha? Well, of course, this has a function in the Zen training, and of course, what this really leads on to is the Buddha's teachings themselves. And even if we go right the way back to the Pali Canon, obviously the early teachings out of which the Zen school arose, not to think that Zen, people do like to use the term Zen on its own, but it's Zen Buddhism, and the teachings of Zen are the teachings of the Buddha as well, but in the Chinese context, that's all. But even if you go right the way back to the Pali Canon, that very first sermon of the Buddha, where the Buddha taught the middle way, and also the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Truth of suffering, that life entails a certain amount of suffering. Of course, it also entails joy and happiness too, many other things. But we don't really need a religion or support to enjoy happiness or a bright sunny day or success. It's the difficulties in life, loss, old age, sickness, and death, as it came to the Buddha. But also just losing those things which give my life meaning, whether it's a person or a job or a situation or a relationship. That's the world we live in. We live in a world that is subject to what is called anicca, or change, constant change. Everything is changing all the time, from the most minute atomic level up to the greatest galaxy or galaxy cluster. Even the universe itself is all coming to be and ceasing to be, and everything in between, including ourselves, including myself, including my life, and so forth. And the Buddha's diagnosis of the second noble truth is that the cause of our suffering in this world is attachment. Sometimes it's called desire, sometimes it's called craving, but it can also be understood just simply as attachment. And this attachment is where I identify myself as something, whether it's an Englishman, a man, a human, a well person, an alive person, a person of upstanding morals and virtues, all these things, and then something happens to turn that on its head, because, as has already been said, all things are subject to change, and then there comes a resistance to change, and this resistance to change is dukkha, or suffering. And this is how the Buddha sees it. This is how the Buddha sees the sorrow in our lives, that we cannot accept change as it is. And of course, quite often in that reaction to change, there's two extremes, if you like. One is the sort of headlong pursuit of things and pleasure, in order to really give satisfaction to my cravings, to my attachments, to make me feel good, to make me feel somebody, as that I am someone. It's not just things that are craved. It's not even things like even when we crave things like sex or power, particularly power. That power usually circulates around a sense of status. The feeling, and status causes me to be somebody, doesn't it? I am a king, I am a boss. Or I can be a victim as well. If I can't be the best, then I can be the worst. I can be a pirate. I can be the most wicked. I can be the most iconoclastic. So all these things are possible. And I've told the story before, but many years ago when I was taking the Sunday meetings at the Buddhist Society for people who came from out of town, and there was a very sweet little old lady who I was speaking to, and she had listened to one of the talks on the Buddha's saying that what has to be laid down is the attachment to I. That's the fundamental attachment, the attachment to myself, the glorying of myself above everything else. And she said to me, of course, it all makes perfect sense. It really, really does, in the teachings of the Buddha. But she says, my problem is that I don't really have much of a sense of self. I have very low self-esteem. I always feel that I can't. I lack confidence, all this sort of thing. And so after she'd finished, I said, well, who is it? She said, oh yes, what I really need to do is to build myself up, build up my sense of self, and then I can, become non-attached to it. Then I can lay it down. or then it can be laid down. And I said, but who is it that tells you that you have no confidence? Who is it that insists it's all too much, and that you cannot, and that you will feel overwhelmed, and that you should be frightened of this? Who is it that tells you all that? That's the self. That's the self-belief, or raft of self-beliefs that must be laid down. And she looked at me, and suddenly that sweet little old lady vanished, and in its place there was something very cold and very steely, and it said, "But I am rubbish." And there was a real strength in those words. But of course what I'd done is I had crossed that self-belief, and when you cross that self-belief, it hurts me existentially. It feels like a little death. This is why when if you've ever been in the company of a group of people, perhaps who you don't really know very well, and they start talking about something, I don't know, politics or a cause or some sort of, whatever the sort of opinion of the day is about something, and you don't hold that opinion. You hold an opinion that's diametrically the opposite. Isn't there a feeling that of discomfort and awkwardness that arises? And if we examine what that awkwardness actually is, that somehow it feels personal. It feels that if I say something, I might be attacked or whatever, and that the urge comes up that actually I should say something, and that now I really need to defend my position, defend my position, and up go the walls, and we roll out all the big guns, and now we're getting ourselves all primed and ready for a big showdown with those people who now I need to put them straight about what is what, and so forth. And this is because these opinions of mine are me. This is how it feels emotionally. This is how the passions, or the fires as they're known in Buddhism, reinforce and uphold this sense of myself and I and mine. Now, of course, we might turn around and say, but my opinions are good, and therefore the benefit of humanity, and people have to fight for justice and so forth. Okay, but there's a difference between upholding the good and upholding the true, which Buddhism obviously also recognizes as well, and then doing it for my own sake. Doing it because I feel threatened, not because it's the right thing to do, not because it's the good, but because actually what's hiding behind it is me. And I remember the late Trevor Leggett telling a story about the samurai whose liege lord had been murdered, and the actual samurai themselves, the soldiers, the aristocratic soldiers themselves, decided to go out and track down the murderer and bring him to justice. And one of them finally hunted him down to a cave in a forest, and he rushed into the cave, and there he was, and the murderer, and the samurai drew his sword as to cut off his head, and the murderer turned and spat fully in the face of the samurai, and the samurai smarted at that, stepped back, sheathed his sword, turned round and walked away. And the question was, why? Why did he do that? He did that because now the murderer had managed to anger him, and if he killed the murderer, it would have been because he had been personally insulted, not because he was bringing the man to justice for the murder of the liege lord. So just an example of how we have two things there. There is the good, and then there is my good as well, and it's the latter one. And my goodness, this is how the passions can even take the good and turn it in the road to hell. Turn it into the road to hell. Don't we say the road to hell is paved with the best of intentions? because once they become carried away by the passions, which are all about me and what I think and what I think should be, and then must be, and then cannot be tolerated, the opposite, then suddenly there's the finger on the nuclear button. And then we're all in danger. So this is why the Buddha was very clear about this suffering, this dukkha, being closely connected with this self, this which he called a delusion. And it is a delusion because it isn't actually a separate self, a separate entity. It doesn't exist. It's an appearance. Again, as my late teacher, Venerable Myokyo-ni, used to say, when she said, we talk about my thoughts, but actually, if we really look at it, it's not that I have those thoughts. It's not even quite that those thoughts have me, although that's closer to it. She said, what it is, she said, I am those thoughts. Those thoughts create the appearance of me and you, and right and wrong, and higher and lower, and black and white, and all those opposites that were really explored very thoroughly in the particularly in Chinese Buddhism. But those opposites, of course, those opposites, those extremes, if you like, produce the Buddha's teaching of the middle way, because the teaching of the middle way in Mahayana is not just the sort of classic story of the middle road between the extremes of overindulgence or sensuous pleasure and privation and very overly strict asceticism, which is how the Buddha originally taught them on a number of occasions, but also actually refers to non-attachment itself, that the middle way is the way of non-attachment, and that the letting go of the extremes also means the letting go of the fundamental extreme, or extremes of I and other. And once the thought of I and other has been fully laid down, then the middle way is attained, because that's the way of non-attachment. And this is reflected in the famous koan, in fact, by the sixth patriarch, Eino Daiken, when he said, before thinking of good and bad, what is the true face? Before father and mother were born. Before thinking of good and bad. Good and bad, of course, is just a pair of opposites. Could be high or low, you and me. Doesn't matter. It's just a pair of opposites. Before the world has been split, before thinking has split the world into pairs of opposites, what is there in that moment? So, and that's his famous koan, the true face before father and mother were born. Father and mother, another pair of opposites, of course. So there we are. So this use of disparagement, of course, is, if you like, a little bit of a sort of shock tactic. And this is why, in this case, Master Rinzai says he sees the Buddha as a privy hole, or a toilet, basically. Obviously, they didn't have flushing toilets. In those days, you went and dug a little hole somewhere, rather like you might do if you belong to a scout camp or a Girl Guide camp or something like that. And he goes on to say that the bodhisattvas, who are the beings who have vowed to assist all sentient beings, and in Buddhist religion, we can appeal to the bodhisattvas to help us. We might even take a bodhisattva as our patron, really, to guide us on our way. It was quite common, someone might devote themselves to Kuan Yin or Avalokiteshvara, or Manjushri, or Kishirtigarbha, also known as Jizo, and so forth. Or the arhats themselves, the arhats are also inspiration. And when, in the temples in the morning, we chant the Teidai Dempo, or the lineage from the 6 Buddhas previous to Shakyamuni, then Shakyamuni, and then Mahakasyapa, and then Ananda, and then all the Indian patriarchs. Those are the arhats. And rather in the same way, then we come on to the Chinese patriarchs and the Japanese patriarchs, if we're in Japanese Zen, which we are. And so any of them, and then you have your own teacher, of course, who is an inspiration and to whom we go for support as well. And also when they're dead, we have their teachings, and so we remember their teachings, and we recite the teachings, we give talks about the teachings that we have been taught, and so forth. And so all these things, help us and assist us on the way. And he's saying that, in fact, Master Rinzai is saying that these bodhisattvas and arhats, they bind men with kanga and chains. Well, we know what chains are, obviously. How prisoners were wrapped up in chains or chained to a wall or to the floor, something like that. But kanga actually is it's a type of pillory. Actually, it was used in China for the punishment of criminals, and it was like a flat piece of wood, and you could sort of open it out, and there was a collar in the middle of it, and you slid it around the criminal's neck, and then you shut it, and then you padlocked it, and so you could walk around, but you had this big collar, basically this big square collar of wood, and pinned to the wood would be the crimes that this person has committed, and this is rather like the pillory in the West. It was used as a form of humiliation, really. Probably people throw rotten tomatoes or whatever at you. So basically, what he's saying is that these are, because it's a form of torture. So and chains is obviously a form of imprisonment too. So what he's saying is that these teachings that they're giving us are basically there to cause us suffering and pain and misery. So he's really spreading it on thick. And then he goes on even to say, and this is why Manjushri, who's the Bodhisattva of wisdom, and if you see one of his forms, he's has the form of a young, handsome blue-skinned prince who holds aloft a flaming sword, and that sword, the sword of Manjushri, cuts through the bonds of ignorance and liberates people from suffering, because it liberates people from the notions of self. And it says that Manjushri grasped this sword to kill Gautama, Prince Gautama, who is the name of the Buddha. And Angulimala, the story of Angulimala is that he was a mass murderer, and he decided for his 1000th kill he would kill a Buddha, and so he hunted the Buddha down and went after him, drew his knife. Actually, in the end, he couldn't. You can read up the story. There are several versions of it. Anyway, but Rinzai says this is why Angulimala took the knife to assassinate Shaka. Shaka is just short for Shakyamuni. Another one of the titles of the Buddha, the teacher of the Shakya clan, his own family clan. So yes, he's really sort of laying it on thick, and sort of providing that real shock value that comes in. And of course, the Zen Masters were very good at this. They just at that right time, this was the skill of the Zen Master, they could produce a shock that could cause their pupil to drop the attachment. There's a lovely story of a monk during the time of Master Joshu, who was a disciple of Master Joshu, and he was an older monk, and he had been with Joshu for many, many years. And Joshu was one of the real great Zen masters, inspired a lot of people. And this monk felt a deep affection for him, and as a special thanks and as an expression of his heartfelt gratitude, he had produced 2 beautiful bonsai trees. Now, bonsai trees, those miniature trees, take many, many years of cultivation to grow, and he had done this and looked after them. And then on the day he presented them to Master Joshu, and he held them aloft, one in each hand, and sort of bowed and offered them to Master Joshu. Master Joshu looked and could see that this monk was very ripe, and that this was the time. And so he roared at this monk, "Drop them! Sorry, drop it!" And the monk was shocked. He had given years to the cultivation of these bonsai trees, but this was his master, and the natural instinct is obedience, of course, to the master. That's why we go to a master, but with that full trust which is necessary. And one hand dropped, and the bonsai tree crashed to the ground, ruining it. But he couldn't let go of the other one. And so Master Joshu roared again, "Drop it!" And this time the second one crashed down. Now both of them were in ruins on the floor. And Joshu roared a third time, "Drop it!" And the monk looked and said, "Master, there's nothing further to drop." And Joshu smiled and nodded and said, "Then take it away." And with that the monk awoke. It sounds terribly cruel, but this is where the skill of the Zen master really comes in, and that's how the sword of Manjushri can work as well. So then he goes on for the second paragraph, "Followers of the way, Buddha is not to be attained." No, because it's not to be attained. You cannot attain something that you already are. You cannot get something that you already possess. And as we know from the Nirvana Sutra, the Buddha said all beings are fully and completely endowed with the wisdom and the power of the Buddha nature. That's the fundamental teaching in Chinese Buddhism, and that's at the heart of the Zen teaching as well. So it's already here. Hence it's why Master Mumon also says the treasures of the house do not come in through the front gates, because they're already inside. But this is what he means when he says Buddha is not to be attained. The three vehicles and the five natures, as well as the complete and sudden teachings, are only traces. So these are the three vehicles. This is the hearers, the Shravakas, the Pratyeka Buddhas, and the Bodhisattvas. These are known as the three vehicles. You can look those up. And the five natures. This is a teaching of the Yogacara school, as well as the complete and sudden teachings. So again, these are just types of teachings. We don't necessarily need to go into exactly what they are. He's just literally saying all these teachings, i.e. what I'm saying now, what I'm reading now, the scriptures, all those talks, everything, these are only traces. And this is again something that is made very much of. There's the finger that points to the moon, that clear full moon, which of course iconographically in Buddhism represents the heart, the awakened heart, enlightenment, if you like, as well. If you look into the Buddha's parinirvana picture, you always see above the canopy of the trees, right at the top of the picture, is the moon, the full moon. It's always a full moon. It's never a crescent moon in Buddhism. It's always a full moon, because the moon acts as a mirror, and the heart is also likened to a mirror. Mirror-like consciousness, and when that reflects, when it's clean, when it's no longer afflicted by the delusions of I, then it simply reflects things as they are, and this is the Buddha's seeing. This is how the Buddha sees, and thus it's the awakening, the Buddha's awakening as well. And so he goes on to say, but all are but expedient means. They have a purpose to bring about a certain end. And this is also the meaning, of course, of the Buddha's parable of the raft, when he says to his monks that my teachings are like a raft for crossing over from the shore of samsara to the shore of nirvana. He said that's all they do, and that's their purpose, if you like. That's their teleology. They have no other purpose than that. They certainly shouldn't be argued about, and they certainly should not be grasped. And this is what he said, that they are for crossing over with, they're not for seizing hold of. Again, we come back to that non-attachment. And Master Rinzai carries on. He says that expedient means temporary remedies for curing diseases. Again, this is the allusion to the Buddha as the great physician, and the Dharma as the medicine. And you get these again, these iconographically. Some of the seated Buddhas are holding a bowl, and that bowl is a bowl filled with medicine. And these Buddhas are called medicine Buddhas. In fact, quite literally, the Dharma, was believed to, cure certain diseases. This is why part of ancient medicine would have been recitation of the sutras. The truth themselves would have acted as a salve. Well, maybe we might not take that quite so literally now, but certainly it's spiritual medicine. And this is what Master Rinzai is saying. As far as he is concerned, our delusion is the sickness, and it's and it's a dreadful disease, causes a lot of suffering, just as a physical sickness causes a lot of suffering as well. So the teachings are expedient means, temporary remedies for curing diseases. There is no real Dharma. And by Dharma he means Buddha Dharma, he means the teachings. What he's saying is that the teachings themselves do not contain the essence of the Buddha's own awakening. We can only use the teachings. And again, not to mistake the pointing finger for the moon itself, please. It is all but surface manifestations. So they allude to something. They point to something beyond themselves, like printed letters on a signboard to indicate the way. Yeah, if you're on the road and you come to a site, trying to get to London from Manchester, say, and you're on the road and you see a sign saying to London, and there's an arrow pointing. You don't then take the sign and mistake that for being London, because it's got the word London actually written onto it. So this, he says, is his teaching. This is what Rinzai teaches, and it's echoed elsewhere when he says, actually nothing I teach is absolutely real. All is but medicine to cure specific ailments. So even so, with the wonderful teachings, the uplifting teachings, no matter how uplifting they are, they all wear off in the end. We actually must put them into practice. Otherwise, no real transformation will come of it. Okay, we'll leave it there for now.